Good morning, everyone. I'm Van Rogerson, president of NC East Alliance. We'd like to welcome you to the second of our three series on offshore wind. In February, we had an overview. Today, we are focusing on infrastructure. And then in May, we have a final discussion on supply chain. You'll hear more about that at the end of the webinar. I really want to thank our partners today. We got some awesome partners in this presentation. Joe Hines with Timmons is going to be your moderator, but we have the Ports of Virginia, Virginia Maritime Association, NC Ports, and the Hampton Roads Alliance. So we got a good team for this presentation. I'd like to also thank our financial sponsors who allow us to do these webinars. We have ECU, Integrated Financial Holdings, and Vidant Health as our platinum. Gold sponsors are Bulling Company, Dominion Power, Electricities, Kilpatrick Townsend, and our silver sponsors are Port of Virginia, Evolve, Martin Marietta, Nutrien, Edenton Chowan Partnership, and PNC. Martin Marietta, to say that. Anyhow, thank you all, financial partners, our advocacy partners. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to turn it over to Trey Goodson for some Zoom logistics.
Thank you, Van. And as always, I'll run through the tools that will be used today. First, we will have a question and answer session after all the speakers' presentations. If you have a question, you can submit it in the Q&A box. If you'd like to ask a question live, you can also click that raised hand icon. I'll unmute you and you can ask your question live. The chat box will also be available if you'd like to type your question in the chat box and submit it there. There also may be some helpful resources or links submitted in the chat box, so please keep a lookout for those. If at any point during today's webinar you need to adjust your audio settings, you can do so by clicking that audio setting tab in the bottom left and adjust your settings as needed. If you need to adjust your viewing options, you can do so by clicking the View Options tab in the upper middle and adjust your settings there. If you need to enter and exit full screen mode during the webinar, you can do so by clicking those four arrows in the top right. And that should cover everything. Now I will introduce our moderator for today, Joe Hines. Joe is a senior principal and director of economic development for Timmons Group. In his tenure, the economic development practice has helped their clients realize over $16 billion in announced investment with over 16,000 jobs created by national and international companies. Joe and Timmons Group were an integral part of the original offshore wind studies completed by Virginia Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy and North Carolina Department of Commerce that helped to frame up the offshore wind opportunity for both states. Joe is a licensed professional engineer and holds a bachelor's in civil engineering from NC State and an MBA from Duke's Fuqua School of Business. So Joe, I'm gonna turn it over to you and hopefully you don't talk about basketball too much.
Sounds good, Trey. Thank you so much. And for you UNC fans, I heard recently that this game coming up this weekend is probably going to take 10 years off of every UNC and Duke fan's life. So anyway, best of luck to everybody, and hopefully it'll be a good game. So Trey, I'm getting ready to share a screen, so just want to make sure we're good to go there. Can everybody see the screen that I have up?
You're all good.
All right, thank you, sir. So we hosted our first webinar, and we kind of gave you the bigger picture overview with Jennifer Munt and John Harden from the North Carolina Department of Commerce and Al Christopher from DMME. Those were the entities of which we were the project team that essentially completed these studies initially in 2015, 2018, and then 2022. Sorry, something's going on here. Let me try this one more time. So we just want to provide the bigger picture overview for you in this opportunity that exists for both Virginia and North Carolina and the East Coast. And as you can see, we have essentially multiple lease areas off the coast that correspond with wind energy. As I mentioned, we have the two studies which we completed both for Virginia ports. I'm sorry, folks, I don't know what's going on there.
Yeah, you may have to leave it outside of presentation mode.
Yes, okay, I'll do that. Okay, is that better?
Looks good.
Okay, all right. All right, apologize about that, folks. As mentioned, we completed these studies going back to 2015 and 2018 for Virginia, and then completed one in March 2021 for the North Carolina Department of Commerce. These studies kind of led to the ultimate Smart Power Agreement, which is the Southeast Mid-Atlantic Transformative Partnership for Offshore Wind Energy Resources, which was entered into by the state of North Carolina, Commonwealth of Virginia, and then the state of Maryland, to look at the opportunities holistically, because we have a unique position within the East Coast market, given the several assets that exist within the Virginia ports, North Carolina ports, and then the manufacturing opportunities that exist across both states, as well as the port facilities in Maryland. Today, we're kind of focusing on what are the assets in Virginia and North Carolina, and how that is ultimately going to lead into supply chain, which we'll be discussing in the next webinar. So again, looking at the offshore wind areas, you can see where the energy is in demand on the East Coast relative to where the wind is. And you can also see where the continental shelf exists. And again, that presents this unique opportunity for us within this market to capitalize on it and make it as cost efficient as possible. There are multiple lease areas off the coast. As you can see here from a little bit of a closer breakdown, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is the one who designates these lease areas and has put them up for sale, of which Dominion has purchased a couple of lease areas. And I know the one in North Carolina, Wilmington East and Wilmington South, or East and West, are going up for auction on May 11th. So really, what does this mean in terms of the overall project pipeline that we have an opportunity to capture? This project is in 11 states, roughly 35 megawatts US project pipeline, 35,000 megawatts, 35 gigawatts, 42 megawatts operating in both Rhode Island and Virginia today. 10.8 gigs are in the permitting phase. The coastal offshore wind for Virginia and Kitty Hawk alone are pretty substantial. And then Wilmington East and West go to auction on May 11th, 2022. And that's got a total of 1.3 gigawatts, of which Lance will talk about. So really, what has happened recently? This industry is finally real, and we have two projects that are breaking ground. BOEM has announced notice of intent to prepare EIS for multiple projects. We're more certain and timely federal regulatory process now, and the target is to deploy 30 gigawatts by 2030, and that's a significant amount of power. 11 projects with power purchase agreements or equivalent are out there. New York lease areas were recently sold for over $4 billion. So it gives you an idea of the capacity, financial capacity of the industry. And then the confidence in the market and the willingness by the industry to make investment in the US is significantly increasing. So really, in terms of supply chain, what is this opportunity for us to capitalize on this infrastructure? There's over $100 billion in capital investment that's anticipated that will create jobs for over 80,000 workers. All right, so next I want to do the introductions of our speakers that we're going to have today. So the first speaker we're going to have is Will Fadu. He serves as Vice President of Industry and Government Affairs. Will plays a leading role in creating and implementing business development and legislative strategies to improve the economic and political climate for BMA members and the ports. For well over a decade, he's been involved in maritime operations, marine terminal development, external affairs, and stakeholder advocacy. Growing up in Hampton Roads, Will graduated from Old Dominion University with a degree in maritime supply chain management. He then went on to serve as a commissioned officer in the U.S. Coast Guard, so thank you for your service, and specializing in maritime safety, security, and regulatory compliance. His resume includes management of regulatory oversight and maritime risk analysis for $47 billion of regional energy projects that were under development. Following up on the theme of cross-state collaboration and Duke versus UNC rivalry, Will also holds a Master's of Business Administration through the University of North Carolina's Keenan Flagler Business School. The next speaker will be Chris Gullickson. Chris joined the Port of Virginia in August of 2013, where he currently serves as Director of Economic Development, with a primary focus on expanding earned cargo volume for the port. Chris achieves this by working closely with state, regional, and local economic development professionals with a goal of locating manufacturing facilities, distribution centers, and maritime related operations in Virginia. Prior to joining the port, Chris spent 7 years at the Hampton Roads Economic Development Alliance, which is now the actual Hampton Roads Alliance. He was one of our partners on this webinar series. Chris holds a graduate or holds a degree from Old Dominion University, where he earned a bachelor's of science degree in business management and concentration in finance. He currently is serving as a member of the Virginia Offshore Development Authority and a board member of the Virginia Gateway region. Additionally, he is a member of the Southern Economic Development Council, where he served as a state director for the Virginia delegation. And last, but certainly not least, Lance Kenworthy with the North Carolina Port Authority. He serves as commercial director for bulk and break bulk at the North Carolina State Ports. Lance's primary focus is leading the commercial efforts for North Carolina Ports general cargo business at the state's 2 deep water ports in Wilmington and Morehead City, North Carolina. In this role, he works closely with many stakeholders, including shippers, transportation providers, economic development professionals, and more to develop port solutions which enhance the economy of North Carolina. Lance grew up in Beaufort, North Carolina, and completed his undergraduate degree in business administration from UNC Chapel Hill with a focus on international business, and he earned a master's in business administration from the University of North Carolina in Wilmington. So go Duke. All right, guys, getting ready to turn over the presentation to Mr. Will Fadu.
Thank you, Joe, and good morning, everyone. Go Tar Heels. You know that Friday is very important for us to give Coach K another L before he heads off. So anyway, it's a pleasure to be here with you all. I am representing the Virginia side of the house, but we're really trying to paint a picture of what the Mid-Atlantic offshore wind opportunity looks like for multiple states. So next slide, please. First thing I want to cover while we're doing that is so a little bit about the Virginia Maritime Association. We are the Commonwealth of Virginia's 101-year-old trade association that comprises the maritime supply chain, about 450 member companies across the supply chain, from ocean carriers and terminal operators all the way inland to trucking and warehousing, distribution, and cargo owners. We are proud to have several members of North Carolina as part of our association, as well as we look to really serve the community that's right on the border, especially since we work so well together. So a little bit, I want to cover a high level about Virginia's port. So second largest port on the East Coast by tonnage and third largest in container volume, and home to 55 marine terminals, large and small, 5 state-owned and operated under the Port of Virginia, and then also 50 privately owned and operated terminals, everything from oil and gas and coal, break bulk and commodities. We are the largest exporter of coal in the United States, with 40% of the nation's coal flowing through our 3 coal terminals. Also largest shipbuilding and ship repair complex in the United States, when you think about building fantastic naval warships and then servicing them long term. So we're very proud of that. And also home to the world's largest Navy base from an operational standpoint. When it comes to commercial activity, we are very excited that right now we're in the middle of dredging to 55 feet, which will give us the deepest water on the East Coast. And we just secured the last bit of federal funding that we need to completely finance and finish the project, expected to be wrapped up early 2025. So very happy about that. And then from an offshore wind perspective, that makes things really interesting, is due to our geographic kind of layout, we also have no overhead restrictions, which is very advantageous when you think about moving large components for offshore wind out to the construction site. So the last few years, we're averaging, I would say, about 2,200 to 2,300 vessel calls a year. That has been a very, very slight decline over the last 5 years, mostly as vessels get larger. But that's kind of a brief overview of where we are from a maritime economic engine. Next slide. So I just want to do a very quick snapshot of, this is our inner harbor, and there's a few things here. One is Portsmouth Marine Terminal, owned and operated by the state. That's at the bottom. I'm not going to touch on that really, because my friend Chris Gullickson will cover that next. But what I wanted you to see in this picture is really, my whole presentation is about opportunity and really playing to the strengths of our different states and what we do best. So for us, this is an example of opportunity in our inner harbor, where Portsmouth Marine Terminal, Lambert's Point docks, and a few other parcels right in this screenshot are all being looked at for development, both for commercial outload and support for offshore wind, as well as long-term O&M for smaller vessels. So when you think about, the Port of Norfolk is really a maritime center. That's one of the strengths that we're trying to play to. Next slide. But I wanted to show you this slide, which is really just a smattering of opportunity, a really busy slide, but this is the southern branch of the Elizabeth River. It connects to North Carolina through the ICW, through the Albemarle Chesapeake Canal, and lots of other facilities, big and small, that are also evaluating how to get involved in the offshore wind space in some capacity. It doesn't always have to be these massive opportunities, because there's so much different room to play. Next slide. So Joe covered a lot of this, so I'm just going to briefly touch on it. Again, 35 gigawatts being proposed for the East Coast. An interesting thing I wanted to highlight is those red shapes. Those red shapes right there are basically the proposed next phase of offshore wind lease areas in consideration with BOEM for the next wave, for the Central Atlantic call area. So those are being whittled down for various reasons when you look at stakeholder input. But I really wanted to show that there is so much more opportunity coming off of the coasts of Virginia and North Carolina. You think of those two states together, 13 gigawatts combined, and 5.2 of that in Virginia is mandated that we have, by law, that we have to achieve that. Next slide. And for our North Carolina friends and South Carolina as well, you see a different view of, you look at Kitty Hawk, Wilmington, East and West, Charleston call area, Carolina, Long Bay, lots of opportunities coming right off our coast to get involved in some way. Next slide. So this is really what I wanted to focus on, because this is, everyone always asks, well, how do I get involved? So this is just one example. If you think about the direct and indirect needs that go into supporting a offshore wind project. So you might look at this very busy slide though, and maybe see an opportunity for yourself. There's offshore and onshore components. There's direct construction and support. There's also support functions when you think of finance and insurance. But for us in Virginia, it was really, if you look at, I'll start at the far right, the operational side, having vessels, having places for vessels to call and receive goods and fuel and stores, an emergence of offshore wind technicians that's going to come to the market, as well as those supplying spare parts. Both of our states have strong manufacturing capabilities, and it's how do we leverage those opportunities to support offshore wind. But anything and everything that you could think of when you think of customs brokerage and freight forwarders, logistics providers, pilotage, security and emergency services. These are all the different things that these projects are going to need. So my goal here was hopefully to help get the wheels turning a little bit about where you may fit into this overall landscape. And then on the next slide, you see the marine and maritime needs. So I highlighted a few, like I said, that makes sense to us and that we've been working on capturing. When you think of ship repair and conversion and new builds, we've had lots of vessels that have come in to support these projects, and they find a home here with us, at least temporarily. And that brings in with it portside services, stevedoring, ship agency, ship brokering and chartering service, and just a plethora of other things when you think about how many different entities and components it takes to build an offshore wind project. Even just our own tube turbine pilot project and how many folks were involved. So if you look at this next slide, I just wanted to highlight a few local success stories in our port of local services. These are local services that were involved in the two turbine pilot project. So the top one you see there is one of our local shipyards and ship repair facilities. That's Kalana Shipyard on the Elizabeth River, which has served and continues to serve as a pretty heavy operational base, if you will, for these survey vessels and support vessels going in and out, everything from modifications and engineering support, as well as temporary labor. You see in the bottom right there, that little vessel, that is the Delta Escape from one of our launch companies. And what was really interesting about that boat is if you see there in the picture, the interesting modification on the front, some rub rails and a railing to push up against the turbines there. And that was one of the transition pieces it was working on. That is not a crew transfer vessel. It's actually a launch boat. But in order to seize upon the opportunity that was presented, this vessel with some good can-do ingenuity chopped the nose off the boat and did the special modification in order to do the work temporarily until one of the official custom-built CTVs could come on scene. And then quickly to the left, you see a vessel from McAllister. That's the Gaspee that was involved in a lot of communications and guard vessel type work during the construction of the project. Next slide, excuse me. And then finally, I really just want to highlight that when you look about growing your own ecosystem, and this is really what we've done here in Virginia, you have to collaborate. And this is just a brief example of collaborating with different entities at the state, between the Hampton Roads Economic Development Alliance, VEDP at the state level, and then the Hampton Roads Maritime Industrial Base ecosystem, and really looking at how do we work together as a state. And as Joe mentioned earlier, how do we also work together as a tri-state partnership about harnessing labor, about harnessing terminal and transportation needs, and harnessing manufacturing to collectively seize upon this opportunity. So I really just end by saying, if you haven't believed it before, believe it now, that there is so much opportunity coming, especially to the Mid-Atlantic region, for the supply chain industry as a whole to really tap into the volume of projects between Maryland and North and South Carolina to take advantage of. So that is all. Thank you for the time, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Chris.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for the recap. Really appreciate you giving that high level briefing on the Port of Virginia as a complex. And thank you for the segue. Also, I want to tip of the hat to Van and Lance and Northeast North Carolina Alliance for putting on this webinar. We are very much a very active participant in efforts to grow economic development opportunities. And many times that can happen there in that part of North Carolina and tie back to activities here at the Port of Virginia. So it is a partnership and one that we hope that offshore wind will help grow, and we look forward to playing a role in that. I never like to start off an offshore wind presentation without at least a few photos or a photo or two around offshore wind and wind turbine blades. And though what you see here in this photo, my opening slide, is not an offshore wind turbine blade, but it in fact was an onshore wind turbine blade, which we handled for, I think, what we all refer to today as the Amazon wind farm there in Elizabeth City. We had the opportunity to handle about 300 blades that arrived to our facility, and then they were loaded to a tractor trailers, and at night were moved down to Elizabeth City. And obviously today, as you drive down 17 or the future I-87, it's a great visual to see those onshore wind turbines spinning in the wind. So I just want to put that up there. Next slide. So Will kind of touched on a photo of the harbor. And I just wanted to give everyone a point of reference. The Port of Virginia is made up of 6 facilities spread throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia. We have 4 terminals here within our deep water harbor. As most do know, our primary business is tied to ocean shipping containers. We're the 3rd largest container port on the U.S. East Coast. We have that deep water, 50 feet in and out, with a dredging project well underway to get us even deeper, down to 55 feet. It will make us obviously the deepest port on the U.S. East Coast, as well as the unlimited air draft, which is beneficial for a number of factors, but more importantly, as we talk about offshore wind, is really going to play a key factor for the deployment. As we look around the harbor, as an operation, we've invested here in Virginia in infrastructure over the past 48 months, about $1 billion towards on-terminal capacity enhancements for shipping containers and dredging. So we've in Virginia have made significant investments into infrastructure, port-related infrastructure, to drive the commercial activity, and more importantly, derive the economic development opportunities for both Virginia and also for companies there in North Carolina. Next slide, please. And so what this level of investment has allowed the Port of Virginia to do is, we've invested heavy into our 2 primary container handling facilities, adding a lot of capacity through automation and other technologies, but it's also allowed for us to capture an opportunity around this emerging new industry of offshore wind and positioning one of our legacy terminals that we refer to as Portsmouth Marine Terminal to really serve as a load center and base for production around offshore wind. So back in January of 2020, we had been working pretty diligently with Ørsted, who happened to be the developer on the test turbines, the 2 test turbines that are currently in federal waters off the coast of Virginia Beach that Dominion Energy put up. Ørsted worked for Dominion to erect those 2 test turbines, but we also at the Port of Virginia began a dialogue around what their future needs might look like. And in fact, in January of 2020, our board here at the Port of Virginia passed a resolution allowing for the Port Authority to lease up to 40 acres there at Portsmouth Marine Terminal to Ørsted for the staging and loadout to support their U.S. East Coast developments, which as of today, I believe they have upwards of 6 projects currently on the books up and down the U.S. East Coast. With what took place in the early to midpoint of 2020 and the pandemic, we obviously saw briefly container volumes dip. And as we were also adding new capacity tied back to that investment that I referred to earlier, it was seen to be most prudent for us operationally to begin shifting any container operations back into Norfolk International Terminals or Virginia National Gateway. So in fact, in May of 2020, we did in fact cease container operations there at PMT, really laying the way for us to continue to sell and promote that complex to the industry of offshore wind. And obviously that has continued to proceed, and I'll touch on the successes we've had. In the photo, which might be hard to see, we did find an opportunity, again, knowing that the world was very strange in May of 2020, Norwegian Cruise Lines came to us, in fact, and we actually laid up, it's called lay berth, 3 Norwegian Cruise Line vessels as the cruise industry obviously still recovers today. But we still look to PMT to be a sort of multi-purpose operation. In fact, we've got a number of different services and functions taking place there with ultimately we will be repositioning and moving that forward. So in 2020, our governor had in the budget a $40 million investment into PMT. It was really tied to what the topic is today, and that's infrastructure. Obviously, it's one thing to have industrial waterfront property, but it's another thing to have infrastructure in place and a terminal that can actually handle the load and the size of which we're discussing around offshore wind components, staging and loadout. And so with those funds, we continued to actively market Portsmouth Marine Terminal as well as other facilities. And we're fortunate enough that in August of 2021, we did formally announce our long-term lease with Dominion Energy. Dominion Energy, both obviously a utility provider here in the Commonwealth, as well as there in North Carolina. They've got the single largest offshore wind farm planned at the moment for the U.S. East Coast. That's the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project, the CVOW project. And so we executed that lease in support of the loadout and staging of CVOW. That is on the top of the screen. And that project is currently obviously well underway, both in the permitting and soon to be in the construction phase. Then in October of 2021, we also had another significant announcement for Portsmouth Marine Terminal, and that was by Siemens Gamesa Renewable Energy. SGRE, as they're referred to, is the really the largest OEM manufacturer of offshore wind turbines globally, and they really have significant market share as well, both globally and with the announced projects here along the U.S. East Coast, in particular the CVOW project. They are the OEM on that particular project. And so working with Siemens Gamesa, we announced a significant project representing over $200 million of capital investment, the creation of almost 300 jobs when you add in the operation and maintenance and manufacturing, tied to the coating and finishing of offshore wind turbine blades. And this is the B108, so 108 meter long, single blade, 108 meters, so longer than a football field blade, being coated and finished there at PMT. And then we began the momentum and closed out the year of 2021 with a MARAD grant. We were fortunate enough that we received a port infrastructure development grant through MARAD, and that was a $20 million. Again, that's to support the infrastructure upgrades that are necessary to handle the weights for offshore wind. And then finally, we at the Port of Virginia did, through our state's procurement website, we have an open procurement at the moment, invitation for bid for the construction and improvements to the Dominion footprint at PMT to bring up the load capacity, the load ground bearing capacity for that project, and hopefully many more to come. So what do those investments on infrastructure look like? Next slide, Joe, please. And just kind of summarize some of the investments there at PMT. And also there's an image here that helps visualize and show you some of those different footprints I've previously discussed. But our Commonwealth of Virginia, as I mentioned, had $40 million for site readiness for PMT. 17 of that went to support the site improvements necessary for Siemens Gamesa Renewable Energy and the factory that they'll be constructing. So we were able to leverage those monies to kind of use a term many of us in economic development are used to hearing, and that is sort of that site ready or shovel ready. And so that's what we're attempting to do for SGRE. The remainder of those funds were provided in support of bringing the Dominion footprint and that project to, again, a level of readiness. So when you stacking that with the PID grant and then the additional monies necessary, you're looking at a couple $100 million there in just the terminal infrastructure investment needed to actually bring the facility up to handling loads that are loads that we are not used to or accustomed anywhere, I think in any port accustomed to seeing. And to kind of put it in magnitude, we're talking load bearing in certain sections of our quay berth will be brought up to, you're talking about 5,000 PSF, whereas 5,000 pounds per square foot versus, what was commonly seen today in a 750 to 1,000. So very significant load bearing enhancements, improvements needed, but those projects will kick off here shortly. 2023, maybe even towards the end of this year, we'll see construction begin there at PMT with full use by Dominion to support CVOW beginning in the end of 2023, beginning of 2024, with obviously, as the map that was shown to begin this presentation, quite a long runway of projects up and down the U.S. East Coast. So, it's not just obviously a Virginia focus, but it's the Port of Virginia trying to position PMT to serve as a load center for projects throughout the Mid-Atlantic, such as the Kitty Hawk Wind, as well as others that may pop up in the Wilmington area, and then obviously to the north. And we definitely have a number of different attributes that are going to position this region, this greater region, Virginia and North Carolina, to directly support and find benefits from this significant new opportunity, this new industry of offshore wind. And so with that, that'll be my final remarks. Next slide, and I'll hand it over to my counterpart, Lance, there at the North Carolina ports. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Morning, everybody. Thank you to the MC East for the opportunity to be a part of this webinar series and discussion today. I'll start by saying that what my colleagues in Virginia, Chris and Will, have presented with the commercial agreements they have in hand and all of the ongoing infrastructure improvements at PMT and beyond in the greater harbor there. Just really exciting. From our side here in North Carolina, there's been obviously a lot of interest from the offshore wind industry. And I would say that we're still really in the early days of working through the NC Port's assets and property and how it will be utilized to support and who the players will be in the long term. But obviously a lot of potential, hopefully, as well. We're watching the lease process that BOEM is doing currently with very closely for the Wilmington East area, which has been branded the Carolina Long Bay. And the decision was made recently to split the 110,000 acres area into 2 separate leases, which will be auctioned on May 11th, Joe mentioned earlier as well. So, you know, there's really good information on BOEM's website. If anybody has is interested in looking at that and the process and where the lease area is, but we're excited about that. Obviously, it's just off of our coast here in North Carolina and quite close to the mouth of the Cape Fear River. So watching that closely and see what happens on May 11th. Of course, at the North Carolina ports, we operate 2 deep water port terminals today. Port of Wilmington, where we handle both containers, bulk and break bulk cargo, which is sometimes referred to as general cargo. And then in Morehead City, on the right there, we exclusively handle general cargo. You know, we see our existing port infrastructure potentially playing a role in supporting the offshore wind industry, but due to the sheer size of the components and the acreage typically that's required, my focus today for infrastructure will be on sharing our waterfront properties that are largely undeveloped and hold potential for industry stakeholders. And I'll just say real quickly, I love this area of Morehead City. You know, Chris mentioned the Amazon wind farm in the northeastern part of North Carolina and the blades that Port of Virginia handled for that project. It's hard to see here in this picture, but I promise there are a lot of wind towers. There's a Costco vessel there with some blades. There's also nacelles on the port. And all of that was going up to the Elizabeth City area for that Amazon wind project. So just really showing how, you know, multiple port assets can be utilized to service a particular project. Really pretty cool to see that. Next slide, please, Joe. So in Wilmington, just north of the port on the Cape Fear River, the North Carolina Ports owns 100 acres. We refer to this as our north property. The site has rail adjacent. It's just off the federal channel. And next slide, please, Joe. So you can see it here a little better in the foreground. It's basically the green space in the foreground of the picture. You can see the Cape Fear River on the right heading south and the Port of the Wilmington there in the background. So the north property on the left of the picture, you can see CSX's mainline rail that comes in just adjacent to the property and can be drawn right into the facility there. And then just right off the federal channel, so close to deep water, we're at 42 feet here at the Port of Wilmington. Next slide, please. Next, we have Southport, located downriver from the Port of Wilmington. And this site, it's just 4 miles from the open ocean with no air draft restriction here. And I'll mention, just going back, I missed it, but one of the downfalls of the Wilmington's north property actually is we do have an air draft restriction of 212 feet from the north property. That's about 4 miles south of the Port of Wilmington there. But flipping back over to Southport, no air draft restriction, very close to open water. And Southport, it's gotten a lot of attention because it's a really large site and it's driven some interest, especially from advanced manufacturing sector, because it is just such a big site, pretty unique to have that much acreage very close to a federal deep water channel. Next slide, please. And then finally, last but certainly not least, is Radio Island at the Port of Morehead City. This site is 150 acres, zone port industrial. It's got rail access with Norfolk Southern and highway access by Highway 70. And from a marine transportation perspective, we feel it's just a fantastic site. Radio Island resides within the same harbor complex as the port, with access to the same 45-foot channel, which is also on the intercoastal waterway for inland barge transportation. And it sits really only about 3 miles from open ocean, and also no air draft restriction here at Radio Island or the Port of Morehead City. Next slide, please. Here you get a little better view of the property. It's largely undeveloped. It has good sandy soils, average elevation above the 500-year floodplain. We do have some liquid bulk operations you can see there on the left. But the aerial here, it really outlines the primary area that could be developed for offshore wind or other marine terminal operations in the future. We have taken some small, but I'll say important steps towards development. On the rail side, the port was awarded a port infrastructure development grant for a $2.1 million project to refurbish the rail track that leads onto the site into that liquids terminal there, and conserve the rest of the island. And in addition, we recently completed an overhaul of the bridge across the Newport River, replacing all the ties and switches and whatnot coming into the rail that leads onto the island there. Additionally, the port has initiated an EIS, environmental impact statement process, with an engineering firm, HDR, and that's going to study the impacts of developing the site. So that allows us to get some of the necessary important pre-work and due diligence done as we move forward with new leases and developments in the offshore wind industry. That concludes my comments, Joe.
All right, thank you, Lance. And just for the record, this is where the Duke Marine Terminal, Duke Marine Sciences Lab is located, just for the record, folks. So, all right. All right, we'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. We got a few in chat. If everybody wants to turn their video back on so we can see everybody. One thing I will say, from having done participated in the studies for both states and looking at all the different assets. One, this is a very exciting time, and there are many great partnerships, because we were part of a consultant team that had 4 or 5 different consultants on each particular study. The other thing I've seen as well too is this has been a gelling factor for economic developers across the board, in Hampton Roads and in North Carolina in particular, given the magnitude of this opportunity. And the other thing, when we evaluate the port assets, that really stood out to me was just how complementary they are, both private and public ports. As far as, the breadth of the infrastructure was concerned. And I just think there's really, as we try to capture this $100 billion market, there really is a lot of opportunity that we can all capitalize on as we go into our supply chain discussion. One of the corrections we wanted to make, and somebody called this one, is actually, it was not North Carolina East and North Carolina West will be up for sale. It's going to be North Carolina East and South Carolina, which represent the 1.3 gigawatt opportunity. But that does directly affect the properties that Lance was talking about, and particularly Southport, whether that's ultimately going to be developed or not, and how that would affect Morehead City, and within the context of within the context of development of the Wilmington site and Wilmington North site as well too. So we did get a comment. Will is the best one here, so thank you very much for that comment. One question came up, and I haven't had a chance to research this yet. I don't know if anybody wants to comment about the Virginia Attorney General's office has noted some concerns about the ROI for offshore wind. Does anybody want to comment on that in particular? Will, I know you're probably apprised of that issue.
Sure, I appreciate that. So yes, some people have seen the article that came out quoting the AG's office showing some concerns with basically the cost of the project and the ultimate pass through to the ratepayer. Lots of phone calls have been generated. The offshore wind industry looking at it as, oh my goodness, what is happening in Virginia? I will say, in general, and Chris and I were actually talking about this morning, this is one of those things that to be expected. That was not an unexpected type question for someone in that position as they go through filing and looking at these different comments. There will also probably be hundreds of comments also favorable for this type of thing. But for our standpoint, really looking at, there's a few different things here. And I know that for our industry, we look at it from supply chain and job creation. So when you look at offshore wind as an environmental project, you look at offshore wind as a supply chain and economic engine. I know those are different things and almost like striations in how projects are viewed. And then again, things like, well, who's going to pay for it? Folks like myself and Chris and others and Matt, we focus mostly on the economic development and supply chain portion of it, which we're all in for offshore wind here in Virginia. For the jobs it's going to create, the economic opportunities that are going to be developed. And all of those type of comments are going to all go in as well. So yes, you can expect to see comments about cost. You can expect to see comments on environmental impacts, and you can also expect to see comments on job creation and economic opportunity. So I will say it is something that we at the association and in the state of Virginia are monitoring. The new administration knows that we're pro offshore wind and how important it is to our maritime community. And so that's basically where things stand on that.
Thank you, Will. Yeah, and another thing that's interesting to understand about how the power companies are dealing with this. Really, the power companies are all about grid management, and they have to manage to their peak territories. And I know in Virginia in particular, Northern Virginia is Dominion Energy's peak during the winter. They also have Data Center Alley up there, but then Hampton Roads is their energy peak during the summer. Back when I was doing work for a water wastewater consultant, we were putting in what they call standby generator contracts to help them allow them to peak shave, so you could take a water or wastewater treatment plant offline and make that 10 megawatts available, or whatever was power needed for that plant, essentially make that available for the open market to shave those peaks. So part of it has a lot to do with that, and that enters into the efficiency of it as a whole. We do know that the assets that they're using for the wind turbines are getting bigger, and the generators or turbines are getting pretty significant size, and that's only going to evolve over time, and the blades are pretty significant as well too. So, all righty. Next question we had was looking for a sense of timing for Radio Island and Southport development if things go well. Lance, and I know, Lance, y'all continually have a lot of looks for Radio Island. When we were doing our initial evaluation, it was actually pretty cool because I just gotten a brand new jet ski and I brought it down and rode around both your Radio Island and your Wilmington ports. It gets an interesting perspective to take from a jet ski.
Sure, you're going to be hard pressed to find a prettier location than Radio Island for a marine terminal. I'll say that, on the Crystal Coast there, just next to the Outer Banks. But in terms of timing, I mentioned the EIS for Radio Island, and typically that is an 18-month process. So we've got started on that, and that was one of the things that why we wanted to go ahead and get that going, because that could be kind of a long pole in the tent there for development. Currently, we've had a lot of interest. We've been showing the property to a lot of industry stakeholders that everybody would recognize. That said, we do not have a funding stack established yet for development of the facility or a partner finalized at this point. So timing is still a little bit unknown for Radio Island and how we move forward with that, but it is, we are leaning into it, as I mentioned, with some of those initial due diligence and building blocks, and waiting to see how things shake out.
So Lance, I'll translate this question to both you and Chris. In terms of air draft is concerned, I know you know that Wilmington does have a clearance, and it's my understanding that Duke Energy actually raised an electrical transmission line going across the Cape Fear River to a certain height to allow you to be able to get passage underneath it. You want to talk a little bit about that, and then y'all both kind of comment on the fact that your Southport facility and the Virginia port facilities really have open air access and what that means for the industry.
Sure, I can comment quickly on the Duke Energy power lines. They were raised just here recently within the past couple of years. And that was a project that the state did with Duke Energy to get the air draft clearance up to 212 feet. So that's tall enough for the largest container ships calling the East Coast today. We've got a 14,300 TEU container ship out here at the dock today. So that was really why the power lines were raised, to be able to be big ship ready here at the Port of Wilmington. That said, you know, for certain operations, we understand that air draft clearance in offshore wind would work, but certainly not if you're standing turbines or components up and sending them out to be to the installation site. So I'll leave it at that. See if maybe Chris, you have anything to add.
Sure. Thank you, Lance. I will say, yes, one of the advantages the Port of Virginia Hampton Roads Harbor provides is that unlimited air draft. So there is no constraints. That is critical when you look at just the sheer size of these offshore wind turbines. For instance, looking at the CVAL project in particular, you know, these are going to be tower sections, you know, upwards of 600 feet. And that obviously and is want to move out, stood up, obviously vertically. So it is going to be critical for staging and loadout that there's adequate air draft. Also, I think it's also a sign of the commitment to offshore wind. The fact that Dominion Energy is really the first to commission a vessel, a wind turbine installation vessel, a purpose-built ship under Jones Act compliance to support the the installation at scale of these massive wind turbines. So we're very excited to see that project. I think is just maybe near a 50% completion there in Brownsville, Texas, where the boat's being built, but being able to hopefully, most likely, that vessel, to call Virginia home. And so that is going to be something for staging and loadout. Having that unlimited air draft is going to be a critical aspect, and then really does begin to limit what harbors can potentially serve when you start looking up and down the U.S. East Coast, and just the natural, some of the impediments that have been put in place over time, such as power lines or bridges. And so that does give this harbor a real advantage.
All right, thank you so much. One of the things I know that is critical in terms of being able to get the components for each of the turbines over to a port where you can stage it to get it out to the sea. And I know that I believe one of these Jones Act vessels, I mean, they operate at roughly, depending upon fuel prices now, probably $250,000 a day. But part of what I think the industry has to take a look at from an infrastructure perspective, which affects our supply chain, is your ability to get in key product via rail, via road, via water, whether it's barge coming from Nucor Steel or coming from Radio Island to support this industry. But essentially, you have to act like a Toyota has what they call a just-in-time inventory process, where they need all the suppliers getting stuff to the particular asset. And I know that's what Virginia had looked at with the Portsmouth Marine Terminal. And Chris and Will, I don't know if y'all want to comment about that in terms of the logistics aspect of how y'all have been thinking through this, because we have a whole nother inland infrastructure side that needs to support this industry to get the supply chain components to the port to get staged to get out to the sea, so we don't have to have one of these ships waiting around 24 hours to load itself up. Sure.
And I think, that's something you hit on, the fact, of just the cost of operating one of these wind turbine installation vessels. Waiting isn't an option. So it is a just-in-time scenario where ultimately the inland waterways are going to be critical. And so to Will's side and really our, I would say, our connection to North Carolina along the ICW, and there is commercial barge traffic today that runs down those waterways. And I think you'll see the deployment of tugs and barges to support the movement of these components up and down these waterways, because most times they're going to be too large to actually move inland over the roads or rail. It's not to say those other elements won't be utilized. I mean, by all means, rail is going to be critical for bringing in the scour protection, the rock from the quarries. The roads are going to be critical in bringing in materials to the factories that are along the waterfronts, as well as certain items. I think one of the examples we use here in Virginia is a company that happens to be located in Henrico County outside of Richmond. And Rose Home makes the bolts that are used to affix the turbine blades to the nacelle. Well, I believe those bolts, though they might be the size of a room, can move on the flatbed of a tractor trailer. So, I do think there'll be some very, very large components coming from the inland markets, but ultimately it is going to be a lot of opportunity for our waterways and those waterfront sites to help support that just-in-time production.
No, that's right, Chris. And when you think about recently, thankfully, the Army Corps in the appropriations process received the full funding to keep the Albemarle Chesapeake Canal fully funded, which is such a critical artery between our two states on that inland side. And yes, taking advantages of Nucor Steel, taking advantage of facilities like Riverboat Terminal down there, and the tug and barge traffic that's going back and forth, that's going to increase, especially here in Virginia as well. Recently working at the General Assembly to get some supply chain money, around $5 million right now. It looks like it's going to land at for an offshore wind supply chain grant development, basically where existing companies, think manufacturing, think maritime related, think supply chain, to pivot, have funding available to pivot into this market. So again, a lot of people think of huge components, blades, nacelles, all these things. And a lot of times you have to basically say, forget those opportunities because those aren't for me. There's only a handful of people in the world who are going to do that. But what about bolts? What about cables and wires? What about all these other components that are going to be needed that can be produced here domestically between our tri-state area, where we really leverage to our strengths, especially cutting down on transportation costs by having it done local and not having it come from somewhere else.
Excellent. So Lance, I'd like to follow up with you regarding your relationships with both CSX, Norfolk Southern, and North Carolina Railroad, and how that can be an asset that's going to help y'all grow this industry, because North Carolina is one of the top 5 advanced manufacturing states in the country. Can you talk a little bit about y'all's relationship with those rail providers?
Sure, absolutely. We're blessed that we have access to both Eastern railroads, of course, with Norfolk Southern serving Morehead City via the North Carolina Railroad, and CSX serving the Port of Wilmington. Here, of course, we'd love to have dual access into both ports, but we can all dream one day. But no, I think that it's going to be critical when we talk about suppliers, and especially on the manufacturing side, getting components, smaller components or raw materials to the coast where they can be constructed and formed into the final products. The railroad's going to play a big role in that. And also just going back to your previous comment too on the inland waterway system, that's really exciting. I think from my perspective, Morehead City sits right there on the intercoastal waterway. It's kind of the nexus. It's got deep water coming in at 45 feet, but then right on the intercoastal waterway. And we have a lot of barge traffic. As Will mentioned, Nucor Steel is our largest customer by volume there, and all of that is traveling by barge. So I'm excited to see more assets coming in from that marine transportation aspect and trying to build that up. We look at the waterway system in the Mississippi and the Gulf, and how much that those companies can benefit from that, where we do have some barge traffic here on the East Coast today. I think that this industry is really going to spur that and help us get a lot more assets, which will benefit a lot more companies as we go forward.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Lance. Looks like we are out of time. We have had some really good questions and whatnot. I just wanted to offer each of the panelists an opportunity to make some closing comments. We'll go in reverse order. Lance, you want to offer some closing comments?
I just really appreciate the opportunity today. We're here. We're getting ready to go, and we're excited about the opportunity. And hopefully, my comments today just leave you with the idea that there's a lot of potential here with the North Carolina's assets, and we can support the industry as it continues to develop. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lance. Chris?
Yeah, thank you, Joe. And I echo, Lance's remarks. It truly is something that I appreciate the partnership we have between North Carolina and Virginia, and to know that, this is not only an opportunity for our respective states here for having offshore wind generation, but more importantly, it's really to create an ecosystem and a new pillar to all of our economies here in the Mid-Atlantic to help support what is going to be a very large deployment of offshore wind to the north of us. And so I just I commend this webinar and the willingness to pull it together, and know there's a lot of work that's been done, but there'll be a lot more work to be done as we position our respective states as being, again, some of those economic clusters that are going to drive this future of renewable offshore wind. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Will?
Thanks again. And really, I want to leave everybody with the idea that there's opportunity here, and there's the easy no-brainer things, but if you dig a little deeper, there's a ton of opportunity at the secondary and tertiary levels. It's really about collaborating. So please work with both the North Carolina and Virginia economic development authorities and agencies. Get to know the Alliance, get to know the different groups in North Carolina, because when we look at this tri-state MOU and really as neighbors, it's leveraging our strengths together, because this Mid-Atlantic region opportunity is something that we're really trying to grab, so that our collective area between Virginia and North Carolina can serve projects from Maryland all the way down to South Carolina, playing to our strengths. So stay connected, be curious, get involved, and plug in where you can.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Will. On behalf of the NC East Alliance and Hampton Roads Alliance and Timmons Group, I obviously want to thank our panelists, Lance, Will, and Chris. And we obviously can't give you a gift virtually, but we can certainly catch up with you for dinner and drink next time we see you. But seriously, there's excellent opportunity for everybody involved, and this is something to get really excited about. I think it checks a lot of boxes for a lot of different people. In terms of the younger generation, I know as we try to recruit employees to the engineering world, they really care about the environment and they care about doing the right thing. And I think this is an industry which really does that, and it's an exciting opportunity to be able to think that you can manufacture a stainless steel bolt that's going to go in one of these turbines that actually needs to be the equivalent of a jet engine type of tolerance to go in there, because you're putting in a very caustic environment for the next 30 to 40 years. But again, thank you guys so much. I'm more excited about this after having y'all on the panel. We have the next webinar is going to be in May regarding the supply chain aspect of it. We might end up splitting that into 2 separate webinars. We're still discussing that, but I think there is a lot of opportunity out there. We look forward to seeing this industry involved, and knowing that we're kind of in the first going into the second inning as a whole. Really excited about the opportunities that exist. So thank everybody who took the time out today to join us. We know you're all busy professionals, but we all know that this is an exciting opportunity we're trying to capitalize on. As I say, we're trying to create problems that we want to have, and this industry does that in terms of how we're going to create the supply chain to make sure we can capture it. So thank you all very much, and have a wonderful day.
Go Tar Heels, beat Duke.
Go Duke, beat Tar Heels.